So we can, if we stand here and you introduce me, then the people that are in the chat room can see us.
So we'll see here now. So we're already live now. So now we can get our intro. We're ready to go.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody to today's talk at UNBC. And my name is Carol. I'm very honored and privileged to be introducing our speaker for today, who is Kathy Banks. Many of you know her. She's the acting coordinator of the nursing program in Terrace. And her topic today is challenges faced by women who experience intimate partner violence during pregnancy. Kathy comes to this topic with a very rich background of clinical experience in a lot of different places, including remote places like the Arctic and parts of northern BC, and places like the downtown east side of Vancouver. She has focused her clinical experience on women's health in various aspects, and I'm just going to let her carry on from there.
Okay, thanks very much, Carol. So today I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about a research project that I did for my dissertation in terms of talking to women about their decision making around intimate partner violence when they were pregnant and what implications that had for pregnancy. And I draw a lot of my experience of having worked as a community health nurse in a variety of different communities and with women in a variety of different settings. I have worked previously as a sexual assault nurse examiner, and so that informed some of my background and my understanding of what women's experience was like. Today I'm hoping to share with you about my project and give you a general overview of it, and then to highlight some areas that as community health nurses and social workers or support workers we need to think about when we work with families in small communities. I'm also hoping to have an opportunity at the end to talk a little bit with other people and just to hear if anyone has any experience or questions related to that. And so I'd asked Alex if there was an opportunity for us to chat with the people who are out there in a virtual space listening to us, and hopefully that's going to work for us. So I'm just going to get started. And as Carol's mentioned, I have a background that has drawn on a number of different settings where I've worked with women and families. Let's just make sure I can move my slides. So intimate partner violence and abuse is a serious health issue that has implications both for women and also for children and for partners. And how they make their decision is often informed by their experience of becoming a mother and the implications that has for them. And so this is particularly important at this key experience when women are pregnant to understand how their experience of becoming a mother is going to influence their decision making and how they interact with their partner and what it means for us as healthcare providers or support workers in terms of working with them. So there is some literature which indicates that abuse influences how women care for their new baby and their ability to develop in their role as a mother. And this is particularly important when we work with at-risk families. And you'll have remembered this for students who are just finishing up their community health nursing course, that we often talk about vulnerable families or people who experience challenges. And this is one key area that we want to look at and offer support to people. So gaining an insight into a woman's experience of decision-making in the context of intimate partner violence can give us an appreciation of why the woman stays with her abusive partner and how she struggles to make decisions for herself, her unborn child, and her family, because they're all interconnected. So the purpose of the study was to generate a description of how women make decisions to stay or leave an abusive intimate partner relationship when the violence and abuse takes place during pregnancy. And in this presentation, I'm going to discuss stories that women shared with me about how they made their decisions. In the cohort of women that I interviewed, they all left their partners eventually. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But I interviewed women who were in shelters because of safety issues for the women and also for myself. myself as a researcher. And in previous presentations, I've been asked about the pattern of staying or leaving. And I want to acknowledge at the beginning of my research, I included this terminology because this is often how we as healthcare providers are educated to think about the experience, is that women are actively involved in making decisions. But in reality, when I interviewed the women, they didn't talk about this as the key part of their experience. It was more a frame that we as healthcare providers bring to their experience. And so I think it's important for us to think about that in terms of what we're thinking about and what the people we're trying to help are thinking about. Because sometimes there's a little bit of a difference in how we view their experience and how they view their experience and how we can be helpful to them. So for the literature review, I reviewed 2 bodies of literature. So I looked at women's experiences of intimate partner abuse during pregnancy. I used feminist standpoint theory to help give me a lens on valuing women's experience, and in particular how women would view their own situation. I also used maternal role acquisition or becoming a mother as the initial scaffolding to help me understand how women would be focused on their experience of pregnancy and motherhood. And you remember from your research course that often we have theories that we use that help to give us background information or frame an experience that the patient or the client or family is experiencing. And that's what becoming a mother is. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that theory. So I also understood some of this perspective from my practice as a community health nurse with at-risk mothers and from my work as a sexual assault nurse examiner. When I was a community health nurse, I often worked with families who had mandated interventions from the community health nurse because of concerns about parenting issues, and there were a number of different reasons for why they needed to have assistance at that point in time. And as many experienced community health nurses can relate to, this challenges your ability to build relationships with the family and with the people that you're trying to work with if there's other reasons for why you need to be visiting them. And so it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge for the nurse to work with the family, and also for the family to see the nurse as someone that's helpful and not judging what they're doing in their home. So much of the literature has focused on women's safety, but I wanted to take an individual focus from starting from the woman's own view of herself as a woman about to become a mother by giving birth to a child she had conceived with her male partner with the intent of him becoming the father of her child. Often pregnancy is a very important time in women's lives, and it's a major transition point in terms of the experience of pregnancy and becoming a mother. It's also very important for male partners in terms of how they engage in this part of the experience. And we focused on this more recently than we have in the past. Often we spent a lot of time focusing on pregnancy as a woman's issue and not so much as a family issue. I also reviewed the literature on decision making to see if it would help shed light on how women make decisions to stay or leave their abusive partners outside of pregnancy. So just a little background on maternal role attainment and becoming a mother. This relates to a theory done by Mercer on maternal role acquisition that later became the middle range theory of becoming a mother, that was helpful in understanding the context of pregnant women's lives and their decision making related to pregnancy. In both the anticipatory and the formal stages that the nurse can engage with mothers in a verbal dialogue where the nurse expresses care and support and interest in how the mother feels she is coping with the transition to becoming a mother. This allows the nurse to assess the woman for stress and anxiety, coping skills, the supports that she has or that she needs, and acknowledgement of the mother's confidence in her ability to become a mother, her feelings of connection to her infant, and her feelings about her relationship with her male partner. So you can see that becoming a mother involves 4 stages: anticipatory, formal, informal, and personal. And it kind of flows through the woman's experience of pregnancy and how it takes on both the psychological and the social adjustments to pregnancy. So my main focus, or my research question, was how the woman made the decision to stay or leave. So how do pregnant women describe their experiences to stay or leave an abusive intimate partner relationship? So for my research design, I used interpretive description, which is a method designed by Sally Thorne and her graduate students from UBC. And interpretive description is an inductive qualitative approach that facilitates examination of clinical phenomena that are embedded in the context. It's particularly well suited as a design for the study because of the strong linkages between practice experience and my research question. And Thorne has also highlighted that the design is well suited to developing knowledge in a practice discipline such as nursing, so where we want to be able to relate what we're doing with families and with women to the experience that the person is having. So it was developed by nurse researchers to generate general knowledge that could be applied in particular situations that arise in clinical practice to help orientate clinical reasoning. So in terms of the sample, I interviewed 8 women. 2 women were interviewed twice, and the women were currently living in a local women's shelter. This was not just an emergency shelter, but a program that included emergency shelter and housing support for 6 months. With individual and group counseling, there was a court support worker and legal aid workers, as well as child care that was available. The women also had access to vocational and skills training, so if they needed to get a job, there was opportunities for them to get connected into some parts of those programs as well. These supports enabled the women to change their lives and to get into a stable living situation. Consequently, the women were able to talk in detail about their experiences. And one of the things that was beneficial for both the women and myself is often when you're working with vulnerable populations and who've experienced a crisis, there can be concerns about safety in terms of the partner coming back, and if you were trying to do it on the telephone with the woman and him finding out, or threats made against the researcher. And so as part of my research, I was able to address those concerns. I didn't use any exclusion criteria, and all the women that came forward were interviewed and offered an honorarium. Technical glitch there, but I figured it out. So for the data collection and analysis, I worked closely with the shelter staff to fine-tune the recruitment plan and in offering honorariums. And I chose to recruit from shelters, as I mentioned, to ensure both safety for the women and for myself as a researcher. I also attended several of the women's groups to introduce myself and allow them to get to know me as a researcher. Tried to show respect to the women and celebrate their role as mothers by participating in a coffin and muffin morning to celebrate Family Day, which was a new holiday, and by interviewing the women in an interview room at the shelter during times when childcare would be available. This worked for some interviews, but on a couple of occasions I did go to the women's apartments to interview them at their request. Initially, when I set up my research proposal, my supervisors had talked to me about the importance of making sure that we had a plan for the interviews so that the women would feel safe and able to talk. And so I had set it up so that one of the shelter staff could offer childcare. And what I found was some of the women this worked well for, but then other women preferred that I came up to their apartments. And so I had audio taped my interviews. I have a few that are quite noisy because we have background information from the child playing or from the TV going. But the women actually felt more able to share about their experiences, and I had several interviews where the women shared a lot about their experience, and it was very helpful for me in understanding their experience. And so that was a new thing in terms of understanding the importance of creating that opportunity for them to share when you're doing interviews and being a bit flexible in terms of how your protocols are set up. I had planned to use theoretical sampling where I would interview the women to get a number of different experiences, where I would interview women that had one child, I would interview women that had more than one child, I would interview women from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, and I didn't need to specifically do that because out of the sample that volunteered for my study, everyone fulfilled those criteria, and so I ended up using a convenient sample. So then moving into my findings, there's three main contextual features. So I found confusion, concealment, and endurance, and I'm just going to speak to you a little bit about each one. So for confusion, from the women's viewpoint, they hoped the abuse would stop, and they blamed themselves for the problems in their relationships. They focused their energy on trying to make their partners happy and make the relationship work. This confusion may contribute to reasons why women do not acknowledge the abuse or seek help. Concealment. Fear and worry plagued every step of the decision about whether to stay or leave the abusive relationship during pregnancy. And the women tried to conceal the abuse in their relationships so that they would not have to acknowledge it to others that their male partners were abusive to them. Several of the women that I interviewed had experiences where they had this was a repeat pregnancy for them, and during a previous pregnancy or when their children were little, their children had been apprehended because of the abuse in their relationship. And so they were particularly concerned with this pregnancy that they not have that experience happen over again. And so they were cautious when they were asked questions about if their partner was abusive. In one case, a woman shared a story with me where she was living outside of the main community, and her partner had taken a sledgehammer to her cell phone. And so the community health nurse, when she visited, said, you know, it's really important when you're pregnant that you have access to a telephone in case you need assistance. And she said, I told her, oh yeah, we're working on it. We're working to get the phone fixed. And she was particularly concerned that someone would come and be suspicious about why she didn't have a telephone. So things like that sometimes are things that we're not really aware of, but floating around in the background. The third contextual feature, and these kind of were floating around in the background, and I'm going to show you in a few minutes. So the women endured as they searched for a way to make the relationship work. And I use endurance here in the sense that the women were looking inward and searching for a way to make the relationship work. The women were trying to reconcile their idea of a romantic relationship with the abuse that they were experiencing. It was exhausting work for the women as they searched for ways to make their partners happy in the relationship. And several women talked about trying to change their own behavior in an attempt to make their partner love them and their baby. And although the endurance isolated these women, it was important because it helped the women come to terms with the tension and develop the strength required to make decisions about the relationship, particularly the decision to leave. And I did, previously when I've done my presentation, I have had some feedback that some people find the term endurance a little bit hard to come to terms with. But it really is a sense that the women are searching for a way to make the relationship work. And during that period of time, they are exploring different options. And so although we as healthcare professionals may not see it as a safe spot for them to be in, the women are doing lots of important work during that point in time. So then I come to the themes, and I identified 9 themes from the interviews with the women. So So in terms of trying to make it work, the women spend their energy trying to make the relationship work and hope that their partner will change his behavior. And in the interviews, the women talked about being forever hopeful that their partner would see that this was a good thing and that the pregnancy would change his behavior. And they tried different ways to try and make that relationship work without acknowledging that it wasn't all their fault, the reason for why the relationship wasn't working. Binding into the partner, so the man threatens to use violence and abuse, including verbal, emotional, and physical, to control the woman. And during this period in time, the woman really does want her partner involved because she wants to have her partner present for when the baby is born, and it's an important piece for us to acknowledge when we're trying to offer support. In terms of loss of self-esteem, the women experience loss of self-esteem as they stayed with their abusive partners because they did not feel they could live without them. And some of the women were in situations where they weren't working and they were very dependent on their partners in terms of access to shelter, money for food for themselves and their other children. In terms of a fantasy life, the women talked about their dream or their fantasy life of a happy family, and this is really what they were trying to move toward. They hoped life would get better after the birth of the baby and that things would change for all of them. Usually there was a crisis or a precipitant event that occurred that provided an opportunity to reflect on the violence and the abuse. And during this point in time, the police or someone else would be involved in offering assistance to the woman. Then there was a phase of testing to see if the relationship was over. And so the women continued to hope that their partners would change his abusive behavior. Several women went to shelters and then they returned to their partners near or following the birth of their babies to see if it was possible to continue the relationship. Desiring peace and happiness, the women wanted peace and happiness in their own lives and for their children's lives. And so often this was a factor in how they made their decisions about whether they could continue to stay with their partner or not. Once they were able to make that part of the decision, then they moved forward as a single parent. And the women talked about their realization that they could provide a safe and loving home on their own without their abusive partner. And in the end, they talked about making a better life, and the women began to experience a changed life as they moved into this phase, and they talked about how their changed lives influenced their decision making. So you'll see in this diagram, and I'm not sure for the people on the line if you're going to see it very well, it may be a little bit focused, but you'll see that I've identified the 9 themes the women described in their experiences and how these themes led them toward making a better life. So I'm just going to go through and the themes and share with you a little bit of some of the quotes that the women from the interviews with the women, just to give you a little bit better understanding of how this decision-making process worked. So in terms of trying to make it work, the women were initially hopeful their partners would change his abusive behavior, and they reflected back to the beginning of their relationships, and they wanted their lives to be like it was in the beginning of the relationship. So they were early on in the relationship, they were in love with their partners, and they wanted to work on maintaining this deep emotional connection. The verbal, emotional, and physical abuse slowly crept into the relationship. And you can see in these quotes that the women shared. So one woman said, "We were friends for a while at first, and then we started dating. This guy just made me really happy. He made me laugh if I ever needed help. He was there for me, and he seemed like a really fantastic guy, and I didn't bring any of the negative stuff from my previous relationships. So that made me hopeful that this would work." Another woman shared, "When you love somebody, it doesn't just shut off. You love them and you want to be there for them and save them. It's kind of sad because you sit there and you say, it's not their fault, and sometimes you'll even take on the blame saying, it was my fault," kind of thing. So in terms of binding into their partner, the woman is focused on trying to make the relationship work and binding into her partner in preparation for the birth of her child. At the same time, the tension builds in the relationship as the male partner tries to exert his power and control in the relationship. And in another woman's relationship, the physical abuse escalated, and in her reflection, you can hear the tension between trying to bind into her partner and her realization that her baby needs her too, and trying to bind into the baby. And so some of this binding in comes from Mercer's theory in terms of pregnancy. So one woman said, when I was 26 years old when I married him, and I wanted to leave him, but every time he said if I leave him, he's going to commit suicide. And he said to everybody, we were living together, but we were not living together. And so he told everybody that I was almost married to him and I couldn't leave him. This woman had related her experience to me, and her abuse started in her country of origin before she came to Canada. And it was significant in terms of the complications in the relationship. And part of the reason that she had wanted to move to Canada was in hopes that their relationship would get better. Another woman shared he had a temper, he would shove me, and I thought, I'm not black and blue, so I don't belong in a shelter. But when I got pregnant, that's when he started choking me. Once you're pregnant, it kind of gives you a bit of power back. Like you realize, I love this baby, and it kind of snaps you out of to know how your abuser is putting you down. Another woman said, I knew it wasn't my fault, but you try to put it on, maybe if I did this or I did that, then things would be better. Maybe I should have done the dishes when he told me to. So you can see how it moves into the next theme of loss of self-esteem. The man's attempts to control the woman had the effect of wearing down the woman's self-esteem as well as her emotional connection to her fetus. So one woman's partner used fear to control her, and I would get intimidated a bit or I wouldn't talk and I wasn't open. Then he would be like, why are you acting like that? And I'd honestly say, I was taught to keep my mouth shut. I'm just trying to avoid conflict, which she had with a previous partner who would lock her in the bathroom and punch her in the face. So the woman learned a lot about abusive behaviors and how the man controls the woman in their counseling sessions at the shelter. And one of the women related to me that although she'd been in several relationships before, she didn't really understand the cycle of abuse, and by being in the counseling, it helped her to see her life in a different way. So she was able to identify the controlling behaviors her previous partner had used on her, but it was a revelation to her that she had not understood what was happening when she was in the midst of the abuse. So one woman said, I was 7 months pregnant, and then, I don't know, I think something clicked. And I thought, I don't deserve this. There was a lot of fighting whenever he was under the influence. It's like he, I don't know, turned into somebody totally different. The women were forever hopeful that their partners would change, and this hope lasted for a long period of time. And so the women talked about their fantasy life or how their dream life would turn out. And with this guy, I think I left 4 times before it was final, or maybe even more. Like I went to a shelter 3 times before I finally left the last time. But I kept going back, and it was because I did love him, and there was hope. There was always hope. I thought getting pregnant, it wasn't planned for us, but when it did happen, I thought this would change everything. Once he has a child, he didn't have kids before, he'll realize what love is, and he's going to love me for this, and he's going to want to change, and it's going to fix things. So you can see from her comments that she spent a lot of time thinking of ways to try and fix the relationship and keep her hope alive that it was going to change. Another woman shared, there was a part of me that wanted that family. I wanted to prove that I could be a good wife. So in terms of crisis, several of the women were brought to the shelters at a time when their partners were abusive to them, and while they were trying to sort out their feelings, or precipitating event occurred, and often this meant that the police were called and the woman was taken to a shelter. This was important because it allowed the woman to get the help, and it helped her to prepare for decision making later on. One woman related, the first time I ever heard of a crisis shelter, a women's shelter, was when I was actually put in one. I was placed in one by the police. I was about 2 months pregnant, and I didn't really know I was pregnant. And my ex had come home from drinking, freaking out on me, and he beat me severely to the point where my neighbors were concerned and they called the cops. And the cops came and put me in a crisis center. One thing about going to the shelters or the crisis centers is it gives a little bit of a time out in the relationship, and so the woman is often given extra support and assistance, which can be quite helpful in terms of giving her support when she needs it, and it also allows a cooling off period of time with the partner. So the thing about that is it doesn't really resolve the issues that they've had in their relationship, and so you can see as the cooling off period kind of goes on for a little while, then often the partner will be contrite and he'll be remorseful, and the woman will start to feel guilty because she still wants her partner to be present when the baby's born. And several of the women talked about how they gradually worked around to taking their partner back or reconnecting with them. This can sometimes be a little bit tricky when you're in a shelter because some of the women had orders against their partner, and so they weren't really supposed to be communicating with their partner because there was an upcoming court date, and so they talked a little bit about that, but you can see the complexity of the decision making and the situation that the women are in. So sometimes they would spend more time together, and then slowly the old pattern would creep back into the relationship and the abuse would return. Sometimes the physical and emotional abuse would escalate after the reunion. So in this example, you can see, I was thinking, I can't do this all by myself. I need somebody here. Maybe he did learn his lesson, and maybe he really wants to do this. So I got hold of him, and he came the next day to my new place, and we had a talk. I told him I really missed him, and he really missed us, and things were going to change, and he didn't want to hit me, and he didn't like the way we were treating each other. Then we decided, let's do this. I think we can do this. And then her baby was born, and she had her son, and her partner started drinking again. He started gambling. He would come home drunk, and she had to face him again. And you know, I was there waiting for him with my kids. She had 3 children, so she had the new baby and then 2 older children. It was like, what am I doing? I got out of this situation how many times already? And here I am, just right back to where I was. So then the women talk about desiring peace and happiness. And these experiences made them think about what they wanted for their own lives and their babies. And another woman talked about how writing helped her to work through her feelings. It helped when I write about stuff like that. It helps me to think I'm a fighter and I can be a fighter and I will be a fighter in terms of getting out of this situation. So, and each woman had a different way that she kind of looked at her experience. So another woman shared, I really wanted to be happy because I was tired of being unhappy. It was really hard because I was really emotional when I was pregnant, and then I had to leave him right after she was born. Several of the women had to go to the shelter right around the time when their babies were delivered. So another woman said, there's a better life out there. There's a happier life out there. When the time is right, maybe you'll meet the right guy. The worst abuse is emotional or mental abuse. Bruises can go away, but the abuse for mental is worse. If you don't deal with the emotional abuse, it's a scar that will be there forever if you don't deal with it. And so they found that particularly difficult, that they were experiencing this emotional abuse and they would feel really hurt by it. And it's one of the things about the relationship where you can't really see this being done, but it's often the hardest part for the partners in terms of trying to reconcile their differences, because they often say things that are really hurtful to each other part of their thinking about what they wanted their lives to be like, the women thought about how they were parenting their babies, thinking about being a mother. And the women realized it would be better to be a single parent rather than continuing in an abusive, intimate relationship with their male partners. Realizing that it would be better to be a single parent rather than trying to maintain a relationship with their abusive partner was an important step in the women's decision making. And so you can see one woman talked about this in that once your baby's there, you realize that your maternal instincts are stronger. They also talked about their decision making to leave their abusive partners was influenced both by their determination to be a single parent and not to force their children to watch their mothers being abused. And for a couple of the women that I interviewed, they had experiences where as a child they had seen their mother abused and they really didn't want their own children to have to live with that same experience, and they had struggled with trying to come to terms with it. And so I think as nurses, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, it's really important for us to acknowledge that, because sometimes that's a big factor in terms of how people are able to make decisions, because of their previous experiences sometimes block or prevent them from being able to see their situation in a more hopeful, more different light. So one woman shared, I wanted something for my kids. I wanted them to have a life that I didn't know. Because I grew up in an abusive family, and I didn't want them to see the things that I see. I didn't want them to feel that pain and stress. So for this woman, she had actually seen her mother be abused by her father, and she ran away from home and spent some time living on the street until she went back with her partner. And so she had a lot of different issues to kind of confront. And then when we look at the theme of making a better life, when the women realized they needed to leave their abusive partner in order to make a better life for themselves and their children, the next step was using their power to leave. And so there comes a time when the women realize that she's worth more, she doesn't have to live with the abuse and violence, and she has the resources and supports to enable her to leave. And this is one thing that is really important about the shelter system, is that it often helps women to get back on their feet. So it provides them with resources and support to be able to change their lives. And for women who aren't working or have don't have their own property, this can be an important step in being able to make this possible for them. So the whole leaving part was very difficult. It was a decision I knew I had to make on my own, that nobody could help me decide. And realizing they could leave their abusive relationships and make a better life for themselves and their children was powerful, and it helped to sustain the women for the struggles they had. So they did talk about the fact that it wasn't easy to make this decision to leave their partner and try and move on, but they felt that it was the best hope that they had to change things for their children. So you can see in this slide that I've put together the background themes of the confusion, the concealment, and the endurance, along with the 9 themes of making a better life. So in terms of thinking about the overall things that come out of the research, the women sensed the relationship was not working, and they continued to try and make it work. There's a crisis or a precipitant event. The woman goes to a shelter, and sometimes the women would test the relationship around the birth of the child to see if it was really over. There's a tension between the decisions related to the developmental work associated with the pregnancy and the decisions related to the management of their partner's abusive behavior. And the women in the city each said they eventually realized they needed to put their baby's needs ahead of their own desires to maintain a relationship with their partners. But this was not a linear process, nor was it a decision made with finality in mind. And so sometimes the women would make a decision, and then they would change their mind, and then they would come back to it again. And sometimes they tested to see if the relationship was really over by going to the shelters or trying to ask their partners to attend counseling or asking other family members to intervene. And this happened before the women realized that her partner wasn't going to change or realized that it would be better to be a single parent. And one of the things that I think is important for us to realize as community health nurses is that sometimes women are in different stages of this when we have interactions with them. And so it's important for us to think about how we can support women and families. And although screening is a very important tool that we have in terms of offering assistance to women, it's not the only tool. And one of my concerns is if we only focus on screening for intimate partner violence and offering women to go to shelters, we miss some opportunities to offer support earlier on when women are making their decisions. And so I think it's important to kind of focus on what the woman is focusing on. And so during the pregnancy, it would be important for us to talk about how she feels about her pregnancy and about the supports that she's getting. Because if we screen at that point in time and we say, are you experiencing intimate partner violence and do you need to get out of your relationship, and the woman denies it, then we don't really have another opportunity to engage in that discussion until something else happens. Whereas if we focus on the pregnancy and we talk about where she is with her pregnancy and what's going on for the family at this point in time, we have some other ways to intervene and offer support that aren't as threatening to women and their families. So I'm going to talk a little bit about implications for practice, education, research, and policy, and then I'm going to open it up to hear your questions and comments. And so in terms of practice, nurses who work in community health, labor and delivery, prenatal clinics need to be aware that women may not identify themselves as being abused, but that the women will appreciate screening for intimate partner violence and information about resources and sources of help and support for enduring. And so even though some of the women had denied they were experiencing abuse, they also said, I still appreciated the nurse coming to visit me. And I would want her to come and visit me or him to come and visit me, even though I couldn't tell him that's what was happening at that point in time. I think in terms of education, we need to incorporate how to screen for intimate partner violence into the curriculum so that students are exposed to the core content. And although screening is not a beginning competency or skill, realization that the nurse and the woman need help in this area is important for ongoing care. And so some of the studies that have been done and looked at screening everyone who comes to the emergency department or everyone that comes for care for intimate partner violence has talked about some care providers aren't comfortable with this, and so the way they ask the questions isn't really helpful. And we need to kind of think about that, and that's why I think it's important to kind of contextualize the experience and to understand the complexities of it when we're asking the questions. In terms of research, although much research has been done to document the incidence of intimate partner violence, the implications for health, we need to better understand how nurses can be supported to encourage women during the endurance phase. And we also we know from past research that if nurses aren't comfortable talking about abuse, then they won't use the screening tools. Women who have experienced intimate partner violence and sought help and were ignored or had their symptoms minimalized have told us that this experience made it harder for them to ask for help the next time. And so there are a couple of really good studies out of the States that interviewed women who went with physical injuries to an emergency department. And if the partner was there when the woman was asked about her symptoms and she denied them, or they were minimized, then she found it really hard to go to that place for help. She didn't feel that she would be helped in a way that she was able to change her situation. And I think it's important for us who work in smaller communities when we're on a remote context to kind of look at what are some of the sources of support that we have for women and families in our communities, and and to be aware that sometimes because of our geographical location or because of limited resources, we still need to arrange ways to offer sources of support and connection for families. In terms of policy, health education in the school system is really important in terms of starting early to teach young people about healthy relationships and how being in a relationship changes your own perspective on things, and effective communication skills and a healthy pattern for exploring difference in relationships are things that we can do with students in a high school that would help to set them on a pattern of behavior to be more successful in the future in their relationships. We also, in terms of policy, need to consider how nurses can help women in support group roles. And so often, community health nurses will be involved in leading groups or sessions with women in the community. And our role sometimes is to facilitate connections in the community with people. And this is something that we could explore in a different way as well. Restorative justice has been one of the areas that's been talked about, and it's kind of a controversial area in terms of how people are able to access services, but it has been used in Aboriginal sentencing circles, and new research about this approach with couples in therapy for resolution of conflict in their relationship, where there's counselors that help each partner and then another counselor that helps with the mediation, can be helpful in learning constructive ways to work through conflict as long as both partners are committed to it. And it won't be a solution for everyone. It's important to acknowledge that having a child changes the relationship and sometimes increases the conflict in the relationship, which could necessitate learning constructive ways to work through conflict. There's an interesting program in Quebec where the prenatal classes include a session where the instructor talks about divorce while people are getting ready for their delivery. And one of the points that she makes in this is that once you have a baby, it changes the dynamics of your relationship. And so it's important to think about how you work through conflict in your relationship, how you talk to your partner about differences of opinion, and that you think about it ahead of time, because often if you're not talking about it, it magnifies this situation and makes it worse. And so there's some interesting things that could be learned from that approach as well. So in terms of concluding thoughts, this study contributes new knowledge to our understanding of the complex relationships between the woman and her child and her partner, the father of her child, by shedding light on the woman's decision-making as told from her own lived perspective, by acknowledging the tension that is present in the woman's lives. And I think it is an area that we could talk about a little bit more, and so I'm open to hearing your thoughts about my presentation, hearing comments that people might have about how their own experiences they've had professionally with working with families, or comments they'd like to share. I'll start off. I have to figure out how to switch screens. Alex showed me, and I think I can do it. But I'll start by seeing if there's anybody here that would like to share a question or a comment. Anybody have any questions or comments while Marion's helping me sort my technical? Yes?
So, is the screening tool for verbal or is it for physical abuse?
What's that?
Is the screening tool that you were mentioning, is it for verbal or is it for
Usually the screening tools that we use include both. Because when you talk about intimate partner violence, you there's different tools that are used. I'm not sure exactly if there's one here in the hospital, somebody that's working in but often it asks if your partner has ever hit you, has your partner ever swore at you, those kinds of things. Is this the screen you were looking for? Okay. I'm not sure. There's a few people online, and I wanted to see if they had any questions. Okay, that's anyone else have any questions or comments? It's a little bit of a heavy topic, yes.
How do you think interviewing majority of women in shelters affected your study?
So one of the things that comes out is if you interview people that are in the shelter setting, you sometimes the concern is that you have a skewed population where you've interviewed women who have experienced the most significant abuse because they've had to leave their relationships. And so it is true, but the other thing about interviewing women in the shelter is they're also in a stage of talking about their experience where you can learn a little bit more from them in terms of what they find helpful or what they don't find helpful in their interactions with healthcare providers. Because often earlier on, as I've shown you with my slides, is that often people aren't focused on acknowledging that that's really what's happening to them. They're kind of in denial or thinking there's a way they're going to work through this, that it's not really happening for them. Yes, Marilyn?
Well, I totally relate to the work that you did in terms of how I see it unfolding, particularly, I think the best scenario is the better life scenario. But my interest also would be that the whole shadow that then casts on the person's life in terms of selecting new partners or that type of things and returning to cycles and them having lost their confidence to actually judge people. Because that, I really like to emphasize that whole issue of the fantasy world that never got destroyed and kind of is the thing that actually leads people to that desire to have that better life that's happening midstream. But it also, leads me to wonder, like when you're saying, like the post supports, okay, that person has made those decisions, but they're still very, very vulnerable. And the loneliness of having done that, and even the stigmatism lingering on, and the impact it has on families, maybe helping them recover financially and just sort of getting on their feet. I think that it's a long journey, after that, and I think it's the recycling of people entering into similar or maybe even more disastrous things, because that counseling has to go really, really deep. And I think at that point, women are really open, to that. And I wonder, how do you see that part of the work with women going?
I think that we need to kind of broaden our view, and one of my concerns about a lot of the focus on screening is it's kind of limited to one point in time, and I think we need to plan for a broader contextualization of the experience. And I don't think that just one way of getting help is going to work for everybody who has this experience. And I think it was quite telling from the interviews that I did, and I didn't share all of the interviews, but different aspects of them. But some women have different experiences of abuse where their partner is very violent. And so safety issues are really important for them, but also the trauma that they experienced in trying to get out of that relationship. And it can have significant issues for their children as well in terms of nightmares and feeling safe. And so one of the things about the shelter is that it offers some supportive counseling and connection to kind of help move forward. But this is only one of the types of services that we have in the community. And so I think it's important to kind of think many different ways of offering support and care and connection. And that sometimes social problems have significant impacts on people's medical and health issues, and so we should think about involving family counselors or other support workers in terms of offering assistance to families and not only focus on the health issues. In smaller communities, it's very challenging to see how many different supports that you have, and I know from some of the women that I interviewed that sometimes they moved around to try and get different services or to change the situation that they were in. And I think, you know, that should cue us a little bit as well when we work with families in the community, that sometimes when people are moving around, they probably need more supports rather than fewer supports because they're trying to get reestablished and they have many challenges in terms of connecting in a need.
So when the women are in the shelters, what's happening with the men? Are they getting help, counseling?
So sometimes men will, as part of the process, it depends on what the abuse was like and what happened. So some of the women in my studies, the men actually physically assaulted the women, and so they were charged, and so they had court mandated processes that they had to work through. Sometimes the women went to shelters that were outside their community, and so I had a few women that I interviewed that were from First Nations communities, and they had difficulty going back to their home communities because their partner would be living in the house, and they would, you know, unless they wanted to go back and live in the same house with him, they had nowhere to live. And so when we think about the challenges that people face, I think we have to be really realistic about that. And so I know one of the women that I interviewed said that she did go back with her partner because the house was in her name and he wasn't going to move out, and she didn't have anywhere else to go. And, you know, it's minus 40, so we have limited options. But I think, you know, when we think about community health nurses, support workers, family support workers, that probably we want to try and work on a plan with a family like that rather than saying, these are the services, and if you want them, you need to go and access them. And one of my concerns is we tend to have a focus right now in terms of how we're funded for offering support to families, where we pick families that are known to have vulnerabilities or high risk factors. And when we look at things related to intimate partner violence, sometimes the partners have very good jobs, and so they wouldn't really fit this until after the incident had happened. But during pregnancy, we have an opportunity to engage with lots of different families and to offer supports at different points in time. And so we should be thinking about a wide array of services that we offer to try and broaden our safety net a little bit in terms of supports we offer families. Anybody have any? Yes?
Maybe questions or comments?
It didn't seem to be. It seems to be pretty bad.
But if you do, at this point, are we over? Can I stop the stream?